All right. How many, just out of curiosity, how many talking points do you have for, I'm going to start with Toronto FC.
I have three for Toronto FC.
I do as well. All right. So
Well, that is what
one,
you requested, so I did three
we'll
as
go one,
requested.
we'll go one and one. And if we overlap, we'll just kind of build off of it. But a little background on Toronto FC, and we're going to talk about what went wrong in 2023. Toronto FC entered this year with high hopes, high enough to the point where a certain DP Pod co host convinced me to take them from bottom of the East, where I had them, to above the playoff line because, and I quote, how can you not look at this team? Which is annoying because somebody in this call knew how bad they would be, but had no choice but to give in to the constant peer pressure from the evil co host on the other side of the screen. Ignoring all of that, let's go back and take a look exactly what went wrong for TFC. Connor, I'm also waiting for an apology for ruining my prediction that way.
No, I think that's hilarious, and you gave into the peer pressure way too easy. So
I'm
that's
gonna
that's on you.
I'm gonna clip that and post it and show that I was talked out of it.
Well, you
Um,
still did it. So
yeah.
what are you gonna say at the end of the day?
What I'm gonna say is what I said from day one is that this roster was constructed to lose, and that's my first talking point. From minute one, I was on record saying that this team's roster build was awful. You start the year with three center mids, the youngest of which was, I believe, 31, maybe 32. I believe the quote that I had was, "How can you expect a team to be successful when you want to run Michael Bradley out for 3,000 minutes?" Does that ring a bell to you, Connor? I see you smiling. It sounds like it's all coming back to you now. Is that right?
You did indeed say that. I distinctly remember you saying that.
That's right. And the answer, of course, is you can't. You cannot run a season with what they ended up doing, bringing in a fourth center mid, but he didn't have a ton of experience. He was sub 30, and he had minimal center back depth, and we're heavily reliant on Italian DPs, who we're going to talk about later on anyway. Either way, the roster was like two injuries away from being dead in the water, and that's exactly what happened. And that's actually my second talking point. But the first point I want to talk about is that roster construction. Three center mids in a team that plays with three center mids. You had zero depth there until you went in and brought in a couple of other players from your second team, and you made one trade for Cervania, but they didn't do enough in the midfield to run that system. They had like two or three center backs on roster, again, old, run down, looking for an excuse basically to say, oh, we couldn't do it, because the second that they had one or two injuries, that thing was over. They only had one or two strikers. They got rid of Jimenez, who I thought was great. Um, Sent him to Dallas, who he didn't do as well, but um, relied on Diamande, who didn't play at all. The roster build in a salary capped system was really cool. And that's my first talking point. Is the first step of how this team failed.
All right. Well, you kind of hinted at my first one already, so maybe this will be a good segue into your talking point on them. But my first point immediately was going to jump right to the star players, and I put a little like I guess a title. I mean, it's not really like some of them aren't very like in depth titles, but I guess the title for this one for me was was disconnect between head coach and star players. And I feel like it was very clear early on this year that the star players, that being Bernadeschi and Signe, were not on the same page as Bob Bradley. And Bradley is one of the best head coaches in the league's history. So it's not necessarily an issue of whether or not Bob Bradley can get it done as a head coach with Toronto. I just don't think he had the right guys for the system that he wanted to play. And that's not me saying that like Insigne or Bernadeschi can't be successful in the league. I think both talent wise are top of the league in terms of talent and what they could do in this league. And considering that Toronto fired Bob Bradley, I think that they need to kind of go down a route where they're going to find the right coach to implement the right system to get the most out of their star players. And I know there's been a lot of talk about like Insigne and Bernadeschi want to leave, and I get that after how awful this season has been for them. But if you get them to stay, go find a coach that's going to back a system that works well with them. I'm not sure who the right coach would be in that case. I'm not sure if you would like have to get an Italian coach if that's going to make it work. But you fired Bob Bradley at this point. You got to back the star players then and fill the rest of the holes in the team in the offseason, which kind of is a talking point that I have a little bit later on. But that's going to be my first point where it went wrong. I think there was just Bradley, Insigne, and Bernadeschi were just not on the same page, and it just they needed to be because that was the only way it was going to work.
Yeah. So I mean, they're not getting an Italian coach now, right? John Herdman at the helm.
Oh, right. Forgot about that. Yep. That'll be interesting.
I've read that Insigne is already going to take a pay cut to get out and go to Lazio, I think, is going to be where he ends up. Um, but here's my section on that, and I'll jump past my second section, is prima donna DPs, because that's what they were. Two of their three designated players, Italian superstars coming over from Serie A, who from the offing looked like they didn't want to be here. They would rather be anywhere else. They had a little bit of fun, but at the end of the day, they didn't want to actually put the work in, right? MLS 2.0 DP signings, if you will. Just sign them, bring attention to the team. But the problem is that most of their funds were tied up in said DPs, and they couldn't build their roster around them due to the roster rules, right? So center mids and center backs are thin because they're worried about getting money for those DPs and paying them, that they're not putting the extra money in to do the roster build, right? Those two showed up with an expectation to coast to an easy paycheck. And when the fans started expecting more, they responded in turn, with Insigne being recorded as flipping off, arguing with, and cursing out home supporters while he sat in the stands during a match just very recently, about a week ago. The two also hated each other. Bernadeschi was a little jealous guy who was like, "Oh, Insigne's getting paid more than me. People are like focusing more on him, and they should be focusing on me." To the point where he just stopped caring. He was cited multiple times for vaping at the practice facility, training room, and team plane all throughout this season. That's pretty much exactly what you would expect from people who are not showing up here to actually play. They're just here to be, which is disappointing. The last point I have here is that these guys coming in with their attitudes set the tone, right? You look at these players, big designated players, big, European superstars, guys who have won at the highest level for club, country, wherever they've been. And if they come in and don't care, what are you doing the work for when they're getting paid 5, 6, 7 times more than you were, right? What's the point? The club is on pace to win the Wooden Spoon this year. The players are a shell of what they used to be, indicative of a broken locker room and a toxic culture. Season is done on 10/21, and John Herdman has a load of work to do to fix the nightmare situation that these two left him, because they came into a TFC side that was not great, but still had this culture of winning and being a part of that treble team. A lot of those guys were still a part of the treble team, and now they're walking out of that locker room basically after dropping a bomb in it and saying, "Have fun picking up the pieces." So I'd expect them to be broken down because of these two signings for a couple years. But it's MLS, you never know. But that's kind of my feeling right
That's why I mean, maybe I'm missing context, but that's why I don't really like that it almost felt like they were sticking with Bernadeschi and Insigne when they got rid of Bob Bradley. Like, I think it was pretty clear early on in the season that Bernadeschi and Insigne were out of here. Like, they were 1 foot out the door already. I don't understand why you don't keep Bob Bradley, wash your hands with the Italian experiment at the end of the season, and then just let him build let him start over again. Like, clearly he can build a team. We saw him do it with LAFC. Why not give him a shot to do it in Toronto? I mean, we know he could be successful in modern day MLS even. I don't know why they didn't give him the chance to do that. It seemed like they got rid of him, and then I don't even know. I can't even say they went to like back the Italian experiment more, because I don't necessarily think John Herdman's like the answer to the Insigne Bernadeschi problem. And like you said, they're probably out of here anyway.
Yeah, and I think the main reason there is that he lost the locker room, right? People thought that Michael Bradley and Bob Bradley were too close. They thought that there was favoritism, I guess you could say. Um, and this is all stuff I was reading on The Athletic today. So, um, there was just that loss of trust. He lost the locker room. When a coach loses the locker room, you've lost everything. So
Yeah, that's
that's
fair.
why he had to go. But they didn't do a really good job of getting anybody in. They kind of waited around, waited around. I mean, you fired him at mid-season. You could have gotten somebody in to do the job, and they did. So um, they put themselves in this position. Sure, you got a
Yeah, I'll
second point.
go. Yeah, I'll go into point two. Point two for me, team turnover. Tons of new names coming in this season. Mark Anthony Kay, Sean Johnson, Matt Hedges, Raul Petretta are just some of the names that were new coming into the season. And that doesn't even count Bernadeschi and Insigne, who really only had half a season under their belt going into the season. And I don't think it's impossible for a team to still be successful with tons of turnover. Not that this is necessarily turnover, but a bunch of new guys learn how to play with each other. Look at St. Louis 2023. It's a completely brand new team. They all clicked super well, and they're soaring to the top of the Western Conference right now. So it's not impossible to bring in a bunch of new guys and have it click, but it definitely doesn't make things. It definitely makes things a lot tougher, and I think that was the case here with Toronto as well. I think a lot of the top teams around the league right now, with the exception of St. Louis, have generally been able to keep a strong core together. Teams like FCC, Philly, Orlando, Seattle, they have their core star players and they're able to keep them season after season and then with the fill in with the missing holes that come up in each offseason. Uh, I guess I thought it would be a mistake to kind of blow it up this offseason, but I mean, based on everything you've said and read, it sounds like there really is going to be no choice but to kind of restart everything. It feels like because it seems like Insigne and Bernadeschi are going to be gone. The team really needs a full rebuild. I mean, I just don't see a direction for the team at the moment, like a good direction for the team. So I think they need to just kind of re-evaluate everything in the offseason. And I kind of hope they don't just try to go all win now and just try to turn things around like a complete 180. I hope they kind of like take their time and build it up a little bit slower. I also wanted to mention, I guess it's not really turnover, but a little bit of like turnover in just the lineups every game. I mean, rotationally within the squad they had, it seems like they were switching up lineups all the time. And I think it showed in the fact that only two players this season are going to finish with 2,000 minutes played. Everybody else was below 2,000 minutes. Seemed like just tons of guys were getting game time constantly throughout the year. And I guess that makes sense when you're kind of already done for the season. You're just going to test out people and see if, is there anybody that we can bring into the next year where we're trying to rebuild everything. But certainly didn't help their chances in winning games. That I'll say.
Yeah, I think that's totally a fair point. Um, but what I'll tell you is that I think a bigger point, and it's something I kind of alluded to earlier, is the amount of injuries they had this year. Their poor roster construction is what it is. But I told you they were two injuries away from being dead in the water. They had players who I think I've highlighted 8 players right now who were out for any given reason for more than at least 5 games. And I'm missing a couple here, but we talked about their center back depth being skinny. They have no center mids if people go down, and then their strikers being meh, right? Sean Johnson missed the last 10 games of the season with a broken hand. Sigurd Rosted missed 8 games. Insigne missed 7 games. Osorio missed 10. Michael Bradley missed 20. Anderson Coelho, a basically a second team center mid, missed 10 games. Matt Hedges missed 7 before he was shipped out. Shane O'Neill missed 9. Victor Vasquez missed 21. Adama Diamande missed 30. So every one of those three that we were focused on in the um, preseason uh, preview that we were doing, along with the guy that they brought in to be the fail safe, the guy who fills in, all of them missed at least 10 games. Your center backs, you were rotating them consistently because they were constantly being hurt or not available. This is one of the biggest things for me. You throw this all together, you're playing with essentially a USL side in a league where players are being bought for millions and millions of dollars. That is going to set you up for failure consistently. You can never predict injuries, but you can build a roster to at least be flexible enough to handle it in case it happens, because everybody's going to get injuries. People are going to get hurt. But to not have a backup and to go out from the start and be like, yeah, we're going to run it with four, maybe five CMs, and then two or three center backs and plug the pieces and make it work. I think that's a really bad way to do it. Um, but again, we've talked about it. The roster construction was bad. It got amplified because of massive injuries to key players, and then the DPs were underperforming and they let it out. So yeah, John Herdman's got a load of work to fix this entire team.
It's it's very it's very interesting to like look at the injuries they had and then like kind of think about, how's the team going to look when they come back from all the injuries and stuff, because there's a few teams in the league where I feel like you look at the team, they've suffered a bunch of injuries, especially like key players, and you look at it and you're like, okay, when these guys get healthy, maybe add like a couple of small pieces here and there, like this team is going to look good. But when it comes to Toronto, I think even if they got all these guys back, I really just don't see this team being good at the moment. I think this team needs a lot of work. And I think that's probably, I'm sure that's probably been pretty evident based on like what we've been talking about the whole time. But who knows? I mean, MLS is really wild and crazier things have happened than Toronto being able to completely 180 this by next season. But they don't look good on paper, that I could say.
Yeah, like I said, I think that they have a possibility to turn it around because of the way MLS is structured, where they can get those DPs out, they can bring two new ones in and fix it. But realistically, I think it's going to be a lot more of how do we get depth? How do we attack the age issue that we have while also getting our young players ready to be sold? Because I mean, they've got, and we mentioned it in the preseason, that they've got tons of youth that's really, really promising, but those guys are going to go soon. You're not keeping them around for 5, 6, 7 years to build on. They're going to get hyped and they're going to go. So how do you balance that? You go find good MLS vets with, and they've just kind of worked on that, right? They've got in Mark Anthony K. They've got in, or they've had Mark Anthony K. They let him go for Latif Blessing. So you've got some people in there. It'll be an interesting offseason for sure. I think that's the best way to put it.
Yeah,
Shall
my
we?
last, I got
Oh,
one
I about to
more
say you
for
still
you.
have one more. Yeah.
Yep. Um, Last point I focused on was their defense. So I feel like the experiment at the start of the season, very veteran back line. You guys like Richie Larea, Hedges, Sean Johnson, coming in with loads of MLS experience and a lot of success to come with that experience as well. But the experiment didn't work. Plethora of reasons, I'm sure. And they ended up having currently the second worst defense in the league. And as I mentioned, I'm sure this is for multiple reasons, constantly changing lineups, injuries like you were talking about. I think half of those guys that I mentioned aren't even on the team anymore. So not being on the team certainly doesn't help. And then I feel like when some of the youngsters came into the mix, as you mentioned, there's definitely some that have a lot of hype, but I think there are also some that probably just aren't ready quite yet to be a week in, week out starter. Maybe a new system fixes defensive issues for them going into next season, but I feel like there's a decent chance with the current roster they have that it won't. So even though I mentioned before not necessarily blowing up the team, although I think I'm on board with that now, just based on kind of it being a necessity at this point. I definitely think you need to kind of blow up the defense and try it again next year. Definitely incorporate where you can the young guys with some potential, but I think you got to look to bring in some new people who are going to work in Herdman's system and just try the defense over again. I don't know if you, I mean, you could stick with a guy like Sean Johnson, but considering Larea and Hedges, as you mentioned, are gone, it's a great opportunity to start over again. Try the defense again because not like you're going to get much worse than second worst defense in the league.
Right. You gotta build it from the back. You gotta be ready to make the changes that are going to give you the most success. And they mentioned that when Red Bull played them last night. Like they've conceded 3 goals in their last 5 games. Like they've just been leaking goals all over the place. So that's where you start. You don't you could bring in flashy DPs all you want, win games 8-7, whatever. But if you want to be a real successful team in the next couple of years, you start by getting 2 or 3 guys you can trust in the back for 34 games. From there, you can build that on.